Sorry to thought we'd get started. I just wanted to say a couple of things. Thank you for coming. This awesome program is brought to you by the South Dakota Humanities Council, so please keep them in mind. And we have some surveys at the end, if you could fill out and just leave. They can be anonymous, you don't have to put your name on them. So there's some pens and everything over there. Just wanted to say, if you have one of these copies, they're from the South Dakota Humanities Council, and it's a very popular series of books right now, and they want them back. So if after this, if you would please return them to the desk. We do have a copy. If you're not quite done with the book, you could check out here at the library. That's our personal copy, but we have to send these ones back. And then I just wanted to mention some upcoming programs. Our next Lunch and Learn will be October 7th, and that one is on banned books. Kind of just how and how does that happen, the process, and what kind of books are banned. And then on the 26th of October, we have a Death Cafe at 6 p.m. If you'd like some more information about that, I can explain a little bit better afterwards, but it is not a grieving group or anything like that. It's more about how to candidly talk about death. So, all right, and I will turn it over to Dr.
Okay. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for having me. You know, this is a very popular book, as Kendra said, and there's there's a lot of different book discussion groups going on throughout the state, but I'd say there's probably over a dozen people who have served as discussion leaders, you know, so it's always kind of interesting to see how one person leads the discussion, how another person leads the discussion. And I always stress right off the bat, I'm not here to lecture, okay? It's a situation where we're here to discuss it, and then I think it's a great book for discussion purposes, certainly. I know that Diane Wilson was here in June, you said? Mm-hmm. Did anybody have a chance to come listen to her? Okay, few of you did. I heard her actually in Mitchell, and I actually live in Mitchell now. I teach at Dakota Wesleyan University as a history professor, a visiting history professor, but situation where I've led some of the discussions before. I led the discussion last year when we were talking about Nick Eskett's book, and of course the whole idea of Standing Rock and the pipeline and everything. And I thought this was kind of a nice follow-up to that book in that sense. A couple things that first of all, I thought I was kind of curious when I was reading about Diane Wilson. I found out that she was a Mdewakanton Oyate Dakota member or individual, but she was an enrolled member with the Rosebud Sioux tribe. And I thought, well, how does that work? Dakota and then being a member of a Lakota tribe. And I found out that her mother, Lucille Wilson, lived on the reservation, the Rosebud Reservation, from the ages of 10 to 16. And she became an enrolled member of the Rosebud Sioux tribe at that time. And that's what allowed Diane Wilson to become an enrolled member then as well. You know, so I thought it was kind of interesting because you hear about the different groups, Dakota, Lakota. You think of the Lakota being more in the West River area. You think of Dakota as with Flandreau and of course, Sisseton and Wapaton Oyate up at Lake Traverse. And of course, a lot of other areas. And of course, one of the topics that was mentioned in the book was of course, where it really all begins, 1862 and the Minnesota Uprising, and goes by a lot of different names. But Minnesota Uprising, the Dakota Sioux War, the Minnesota conflict, Dakota conflict, there's a lot of names that were used for it, certainly. But when I heard Diane Wilson speak, and maybe she mentioned this when she spoke to your group as well, she said it took 20 years to learn what she needed to learn. And then it took her 10 years to write the book, you know, and I think that's really true because there's a lot in the book, certainly a lot in the book. In fact, even just the language. I think one of the neatest part of the book is the fact that she uses the Dakota words so fluently, so well. And I'll just mention this too. When we have these book discussions, not everybody has read the book. So I apologize in advance if we have any spoilers because I think some of the biggest twists come at the very end. But the other thing is that for people who have not read the book, I've been at book discussions where somebody said, well, I did not read the book, but I listened to it on audio. And she said that what you really liked about it is that in this case, there are four narrators, right? And each part of that was a different person, so it's not like you're listening to an audiobook and it's the same narrator all the way throughout. You have a narrator playing the part of Marie Blackbird. You have a narrator playing the part of Rosalie. You have a narrator playing the part of Gabby. You have a narrator playing the part of Darlene. So you have the different voices, but she said also you have the pronunciations of the words, so there's a lot of words that she included. And that was part of her experience, to spend 20 years learning what she needed to learn. And then it took her 10 years to actually write the book. And I can see that certainly. And for people who are involved in book clubs, certainly, I don't know about you, but it seemed like as I was getting to certain parts and certain mentions here and there, I thought, oh, that sounds a lot like Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eyes. And then at the very end, she says, yeah, she read that book and she got that idea of The Bluest Eyes from Toni Morrison's book, certainly. There was another part where she starts talking about the idea of gardening, obviously the big aspect of this, and the fact that when she first started her attempt at gardening, and we'll talk about that, but then how she learned towards the end that, no, this is how the gardens should be arranged. I thought, that sounds a lot like Buffalo Bird Woman's Garden, story of a Hidatsa woman who through a translator, she said, well, this is how the Hidatsa, the Mandan, the Arikara, the village farmers, this is how they had their gardens arranged. I thought, oh, that sounds a lot like it. Oh, and then, yeah, at the very end, she says, this is one of her sources as well. So she has a number of different sources that if you read a lot in this area, you think that you can see where she uses that influence, certainly. And so she really did include a lot of information. I can see where she would spend a great deal of time learning what she needed to learn in order to write the book. And then to write the book, again, it's something you just don't do overnight. Not too many people can do that, but a situation where it took her 10 years to put it all together. And she talked about, approaching it from this direction, and then all of a sudden changing it. And, so you imagine over a 10-year period of time, there had to be a lot of revising that took place, certainly during that period. So like I said, we can start in a couple different places, and I try to give the group an option, and we'll just open it up from there. But we do have the four narrators. We have Marie Blackbird, where the story really begins in 1862. Although in terms of her chapter where she starts narrating, that's not until chapter 11. And I guess I'll just ask her right now, did that kind of throw you off when you went from chapter to chapter and different narrators?
Very much.
Did you like that, or find it confusing, or?
It was fun.
Yeah, it was. You had to pay attention, because there was one point where I'm thinking, oh, this is Rosalie, and then I got about half a page into it. I thought, no, this is Gabby, And so I had to pay a little bit closer attention to who's narrating which chapter. But in the first case, I talked about Marie Blackbird, going back to 1862. And this is where the story really begins, but you don't hear about Marie Blackbird until chapter 11, as far as explaining what's going on in 1862 and then how all this story of being the seed keeper really comes into play. Then, of course, most of it is about Rosalie Ironwing. And it's interesting that if you look at the chapters, again, paying attention, her chapters in which she's narrating Rosalie Ironwing, then she gets married, and so it's Rosalie Ironwing Meister, and then once Tom passes away, then it's John passes away, then it's a situation where she goes back to just Rosalie Ironwing. So a little subtlety there as far as going from chapter to chapter, but it's really her story that she's sharing. Gabby, her who would become her best friend, I guess, during high school and even beyond that, certainly. And then Darlene Killsdeer, who was a long lost relative. She had no idea that she had any relatives anymore. So we have the four different narrators, and so we can look at it from Marie and her story going back to 1862 when she was 14, going up to when the story really finishes, which is 2022. So we're looking at pretty lengthy period of time from 1862 to 2022, certainly. And a lot of narrators included in that. So we could take a look at it if you wanted to say something about the different narrators and some of the different things that they brought up into the story itself. Or there are themes. I think there's some very, very significant themes that we can look at as far as historical themes. For example, 1862, as I mentioned, the Dakota War. You know, that's obviously a very important part of this story and where it all begins, as I said. You can look at the role of foster homes, which was very important for Rosalie and as her character. She went through 2 different foster homes, which also would take us to the Indian Child Welfare Act of 1978, very significant, but something that came about after Rosalie was going through these foster home experiences. So had the Indian Child Welfare Act been passed earlier, Rosalie would not have had to deal with the bad experiences that she did with her foster homes. So that's another thing we look at. The idea of boarding schools, because we see from the whole idea of going from the Minnesota uprising, the Dakota uprising, conflict, whatever you want to call it, there's about a dozen different names that are used to refer to it. But after that conflict, you have a situation where a lot of the Dakota are moved from Minnesota to various areas. So the idea of Crow Creek, for example, the Crow Creek Reservation, predominantly Dakota speakers. Right across the river, you have Lower Brule, which is primarily Lakota speakers. They're right across the river from one another. But the Crow Creek Reservation was established by people being moved from Minnesota into that Crow Creek Reservation. Santee down in Nebraska, same situation, you know, so you have a lot of Dakota that are moved out of Minnesota and moved to various places, moved to reservations. So we could look at of course, not only the creation of these reservations, but then of course, there's the boarding schools as well. You know, so there's the experiences that they had to go through in terms of the boarding schools. That's a whole nother thing that we take a look at. And then of course, I asked Diane Wilson when I heard her speak, and I said, so South Dakota being such an agricultural state, did you ever experience a lot of criticism because she's talking about organic farming? She's really being quite dismissive of the whole idea of big agriculture and big corporations and different genetically modified crops and things like that. And so there's that aspect too. And she said, well, no, she expected a lot more. She expected a lot more resistance or a lot more criticism because of farmers. And there were a lot of people who said, well, yeah, my family's a farm family and we farm for generations. And you know, if you're going to stay in the business, you have to adjust. You have to make those accommodations as time goes on. But obviously for Diane Wilson, it's a situation for her where she's very adamant about don't buy the packets of seeds that you see at Walmart or Target or wherever it might be, because those have been modified. When you start talking about big agriculture, big crops, you know, those are again, crops that have been modified quite a bit. When we look at an ear of corn, who brought this? Thank you for this. She brought a centerpiece for us. But you think of the ear of corn now, and you think about how large it is compared to 1862, when it probably would have been about this big. You know, remember that her son, he'll actually leave Darlene's place after being given an ear of corn. What does he do? He sticks it in his pocket. Well, yeah, it wasn't anything quite that large. It was something much smaller that he puts in his pocket and carries with him. So the whole idea of the crops, the hybrids, the development in terms of genetics and how that's affected agriculture, that's a whole nother thing. So I'll open it up for this for any kind of questions. Do you want to talk about some of the narrators? Marie, Rosalie, Gabby, Darlene, or do you want to talk about some of the themes? The Dakota War, foster homes, Indian Child Welfare Act, boarding schools, and the whole idea of farming versus gardening. Who would like to start with a comment?
I think boarding schools would be interesting.
They are interesting, and there's been so much attention brought to the boarding schools, and in the one case, they talk about how Marie was 14 years old when 1862 conflict was taking place. And remember, her father, he's gone off to fight. She doesn't know where he is. Her mother is with her and her little brother, newborn child, very young child certainly. And the mother says, well, I'm gonna have to go and try to find some food and everything. So she leaves. And so here's Marie Blackbird, 14 years old, with a very small child, trying to hide out from the soldiers that are in the area and so on. And of course, one of the things that she comes across, and this is where you see the Toni Morrison impact, I guess, is that a soldier does find her. And of course, what happens? Whiskey breath, slaps her, knocks her unconscious, and rapes her. And she has a child, so Marie is the great grandmother of Rosalie's character. And so, but her great grandmother was a result of that rape that occurred back that period of time. But you talk about the boarding schools from there, again, being sent to different places, Crow Creek, Santee. It's interesting that when you talk about the boarding schools, you hear so much about how when children were brought in, their hair was cut, their clothing was changed, they were beaten if they spoke in their native language and so on. But in the case of Minnesota, you have the AMA, and that's the American Ministerial Association. And one of the key individuals that was involved with that was a man by the name of Stephen Riggs. And Stephen Riggs, he actually came up with one of the very first, if not the first, dictionary between Dakota and English. So to actually look at it and say, oh yeah, here's the English word, here's the Dakota word. And when the Riggs family and others who were part of the American Ministerial Association started a lot of these boarding schools at Santee and other places like at Crow Creek and so on, it was a situation where they were different in the sense that they said, what's wrong with teaching these children in their language? So they did allow for that. And at one point there was a mention in that too, that, oh, the nice thing about Santee is the Santee Normal School is that they were allowed to speak their own language. They didn't have to worry about being beaten. Now, there might have been other things that were not so pleasant. Obviously, there's still a lot of abuse and everything, but those schools with the Riggs family, they found it easier to actually teach in the Dakota language. So they did that. In the case of the Riggs, again, just kind of a little bit of a follow-up to that. You have Stephen Riggs. He has two, he has a number of children, but two of the more notable ones, Thomas Riggs and Alfred Riggs. Alfred Riggs is the one who taught at, and this is the history part of it. I mean, it's a novel, but the history part of it is that Alfred Riggs was a real person. He did teach at the Santee Normal School down in Nebraska. Thomas Riggs, he would teach at the Owyhee School in the Pierre area. And Thomas would have a son who would go on to become a medical doctor. And so I always throw this out just to make some kind of connections here, I guess. What is the official name of Pierre High School?
T.F. Riggs.
T.F. Riggs.
Yeah.
It's not for Thomas Riggs, it's for Thomas's son, Theodore Riggs. So yeah, the fact that we have T.F. Riggs High School and Pierre High School, there's a connection to the boarding schools and to the Riggs family and everything. So yeah, it's a novel, but there's a lot of history involved in that. Yes.
Is the Indian school in Pierre an offshoot of this one or
Yes, it is. Yes, and
That's
that's still operating.
still a boarding school?
Still a boarding school, yeah, and there's still boarding schools that are out there certainly. Quite a few of them actually, but we like to think that things are so much different today than they were the previous generations, I guess. So other comments, anything else you wanted to mention about the boarding school experience?
Well, if it's still operating, who are the people attending?
Who are the people attending?
Yeah.
Families who send their children to these various schools. So I think, and there are tribal boarding schools. There are the private boarding schools. You go over to Chamberlain and you have St. Joseph there, Red Cloud. So these are schools where children go and they live in dormitories and they spend much of the year there. And then during the summer, they may go home. That's a situation where.
Schools for Native children or are
Yes.
they,
Yes.
but white families don't send their children?
No, it's you'd probably have some white instructors, but the children, students are
And do they use
tribal.
Lakota? Do they use the native language?
They actually, if you ever have a chance, if you do social media, if you do Facebook, and just out of just one example, I guess, but the St. Joseph Indian School in Chamberlain is connected to the Akta Lakota Museum. It's also on the same campus. Excellent museum, and they stress the native language quite a bit. In fact, they have I think they call it Word Wednesday, where every Wednesday they come up with certain words, certain phrase, and they have one of the students who tells you how to pronounce the word and then what it means, you know. So I think that's got a kind of neat, just again, hear the actual pronunciation, because I'm not a native speaker, so but to hear how the word is actually pronounced. And that's why the one person said that she really liked the audiobooks, because they had the people who could speak the language doing the narration at each part. So, but yeah, that's a great school, and it's very well received. Yes. Okay.
You're making reference to these schools around the state of South Dakota. Do other states have them operating still?
Yes, there are other boarding schools in other states. A friend of mine, a colleague, he taught at a boarding school on a reservation in Montana for a long time before he moved back to South Dakota. So they're still out there. But we always hear about all the terrible things that happened before. Yes, sir.
So is it always the choice of the family to send their children to these schools?
Today it is, yes, today it is. But they talk about in the book, of course, how the children were, how Darlene was supposed to be babysitting or watching the children, and when came home, found out they were here, and they took all the kids, you know, and she didn't know what to say. You know, they're here, they took the children, and so situations where, yeah, back in the days, it would be the whole idea that the officials would come around and they'd say, no, you have to have your children educated. We're going to take your child, and maybe not even explain to the family where they were taking the children, you know, whether it's in Pierre or whether it's Chamberlain or Santee or anything like that. A lot of times people had no idea whatever happened to those children, you know.
So social services never gets involved in any of these families if there's
Back
problems
then?
in the family?
No, but with the
Well, I had a friend that was a counselor at the Pier one, and I thought there were children, maybe they were in the foster system or social services or poverty. It seemed like, because some of the things she had to deal with, just ordering underwear for little boys, you know, it just made me wonder if
right,
that wasn't true.
Right.
Sometimes.
As far as
I can understand
having
where.
having them assigned to.
Yeah,
a
where
boarding
if you
school.
have kids in the foster system, you can't find any place for them.
Actually, my friend was a foster care kid. She's Native American and she was sent to a boarding school in Oklahoma, so it does happen. I
It
don't
does.
know.
And then,
And especially when you start talking about situations where you're talking about children who have no other family
that's
members.
what I got.
Then that's where you have
Any
authorities coming
place for
in.
those kids.
And the thing with Rosalie is that she went through those 2 foster homes, not good experiences. And but that was before the Indian Child Welfare Act of 1978.
Yeah.
And so with the Indian Child Welfare Act says now that if you have a child who does not have any legal guardians and there's no other family, that those arrangements will be made to keep the child within their culture, as opposed to having them fostered by somebody who has no idea what the culture and the history is all about. So yes, in the far back.
The schools in the book, the Indian boarding schools, were they usually funded by the government or from different religious organizations? Which?
In this case, when she talked about the Santee and others, those were through the American Ministerial Association. So those were religious. And it's kind of hard to imagine that a religious program like that would be so abusive, but.
So how about now? I mean, I know like St. Joseph's, things like that,
Mm.
but are a lot of them funded by the government now?
If anything, through the federal government, if there's any funding through the tribes, and then the tribes can have their schools.
Okay.
But St. Joseph is Catholic.
Yeah.
Red Cloud is Catholic. You know, so it depends on the school.
I think they get donations. from
Oh,
the
yeah, St. Joseph, I know that. In fact, I had met a gentleman from from Florida, never been to South Dakota, but one of the areas to which he would donate his money yearly is to some school called St. Joseph Indian School in South Dakota. Never been to South Dakota, but he donates annually to that school, so.
They have a pretty big PR.
Oh, yes, yeah.
I wanted to say too, that if you get to Rapid, the Journey Museum has a really beautiful haunting exhibit of the boarding schools. It's pretty simple, but it's just clotheslines on posts with black and white photos of the kids in the school, and you just stare at those faces and you can just see the pain and the suffering and just how they're in that survival where they've just tuned out.
You've just lost your
Oh.
family. You don't know if you're gonna
And
see
when
mom
they
and
cut
dad,
their
your
hair,
siblings
it was
again.
a significant thing too.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Because they only cut their hair if they were mourning,
Right, in fact,
but I
there's a
guess they were probably
were
mourning.
mourning.
couple things that I want to mention real quickly. First of all, let's talk about the foster moms that Rosalie had to deal with. And then your comment about cutting of the hair, I guess, we'll segue into that, but Rosalie in the book had to deal with two different foster moms. The first foster mom, and of course, there are a lot of wonderful people who do foster children. I don't want to downplay that certainly, but there's also a lot of people who use that whole situation because you get certain funding for every child that you foster, and a lot of them maybe just simply don't care, you know. And then that was Rosalie's experience, that when she talks about her two foster moms that she had, she did not care for either one of them, right? It's the first case, first foster mom, her husband was a over the road truck driver, and so he was gone a lot, and so it was really the foster mom and Rosalie. And Rosalie was young. She was in her teenage years certainly, but her mom was not very supportive certainly. And her mom, quite honestly, she would drink and go to bed. She said that, Rosalie said, I grew up with my dad, and we had they said that, the plant life was her garden. That it was their grocery store. She knew that this plant and this plant, how they could be used, whether it was for medicine or for food or whatever the case might be, tea and things like that. She knew all about these different plants growing up with her father. Well, then she was 12 years old when her father passed away. And so she goes to the first foster home, and she has this woman who is drunk quite a bit of the time. And it got to the point where she hated all this prepared food. She liked fresh food. So she goes out to the backyard and she sets a snare for what? For a rabbit, right? So, and she catches a rabbit. She knew how to do this. Her father had showed her how to set a snare and catch a rabbit. So she catches a rabbit, takes it into the kitchen, and she starts butchering it. And here comes the foster mom walking out, and here's Rosalie, knife in hand, blood, everything else. And she screams. She goes into her bedroom, locks the door, calls the authorities. And of course, the police officer, who shows up, and when he comes into the house, he sees, here's this young girl with a knife, but he sees what she's doing. And she said something to the fact that obviously he was a hunter, and he just kind of smiled, but nonetheless, the foster mom said, I don't want her in my house anymore, and so she goes from that house to the next one. And that foster mom is certainly no better than the first. She's also very, very abusive, if not physically, at least certainly in terms of emotionally, very abusive. In fact, one of the first parts of the book was where Rosalie is sitting there, and the ceiling is leaking, and she's supposed to be mopping the leaks and everything else. And she's going through the laundry, and she finds her foster mom's sweatshirt that she always wore. Remember what she did to the sweatshirt? She put a hole, not just a hole. She didn't just cut a hole in the sweatshirt, but she cut a hole in the sweatshirt where her foster mom's heart would normally be. So it's symbolic in that sense. And then when she left the house, when she's walking down the sidewalk, what's that whole children's thing about stepping on cracks? Break your mama's back. And she was deliberately stepping on every crack because she wanted to break her foster mom's back, so that was resentment, that she did not have good experiences with foster homes. She did not. Because of that, she grew up not really speaking her language, not having the cultural ties. I mean, this is in the Minnesota area, Mankato and surrounding communities, but it's a situation where she doesn't really know anything about her culture. She doesn't really know anything about her history. She doesn't know anything about her mother. And every time when her father was still alive, she would bring up her mom, he wouldn't talk about her. He wouldn't talk about her, you know? But she made a promise to her father. And actually he kind of insisted on this, that when you marry a Dakota, don't marry a white man. Well, then she marries a white man. And you mentioned the idea of cutting hair in mourning. Rosalie does that, right? First time she goes to church with her husband, and all of a sudden she starts feeling a little queasy. She gets up, she runs out in the middle of the service, everybody's looking at her, and she goes into the restroom, and of course she starts vomiting. And one of the church ladies came in and said, "You're not pregnant, are you?" And of course, yeah, she is. And so it's a situation where not only did she marry a white man, but now she's having a child with this man, and she just feels like she's betrayed her father. So she goes home, and what does she do? She starts cutting her hair, you know, because she's mourning.
That was
She's
the way of grieving for her father.
grieving for her father. Yeah, that she had made this promise to her father when she was so young. And now she just feels like she's betrayed her father, you know, so there's that whole idea of mourning and in the sense of betrayal. You know, that's a very good point. I'm glad you brought that up. Other areas you want to look at, either narration or events that they refer to.
When she was pregnant with this child, she, didn't know but she knew that the name would be Wakpa River, because a child born of water is always moving. So
Right.
that was kind of cute.
Yes, and then you have Rosalie having her son that her husband wants to call Tommy because of his father. So usually naming the child after the grandfather in this case, so calling him Tommy or Thomas. But she says, no, I'm going to call him Wakpa, meaning river. So a few weeks ago, I was with a tour company in the Fort Pierre area, and we went over to Wakpa Shicha. Well, Wakpa River, Shicha, bad river right in the Fort Pierre area. And so, yeah, she refers to him as Wakpa, not bad, but Wakpa is just in river. Wakpa is the Dakota word for that. Her best friend, Gabby, she has a child. And actually, she has a child that's older than Wakpa, certainly, but she names her child. Anybody catch that? Mato. Mato means bear. You know, so you have both these girls having sons, and they refer to them by the Dakota or Lakota names of Wakpa River and Mato bear, and they become friends as well over a period of time. Yes.
I just thought it was such a strong device on the part of the author to have her marry this white man, and this, she could have so easily moved into a stereotypical portrait of this man, but instead, we like him, we understand him.
Mm-hmm.
I just think it was so human. And then to have her son have the conflict with her son again, nothing was slick.
Mm.
Everything was how real life is, which is complicated,
Right.
and not what you think you write a script when you're in your 20s, and then when you're 77, you realize,
Yeah.
what happened to that script? And I think she really follows. She's a very organic, authentic writer, I think.
Absolutely, I think so too. Yeah, and then her point being that you have Wakpa, you have Thomas growing up in a biracial family between his mother, and his father. But in that part of Minnesota, also it was something that was very, very significant as well, being biracial. In fact, there's the one part where her husband John takes her to I think it's, I'm not sure it's Mankato or which community it is, but they have the huge monument there. Which one?
New Ulm.
New Ulm,
Yeah.
thank you, New Ulm. And there's the big monument, which really does exist in New Ulm, that talks about the 1862 and talks about the situation where all the people who were killed as a result of the uprising and everything. And so it's a situation where he said, a lot of them probably deserved it. And he's talking about it being a white man, talking about these white families who were killed because of the uprising. And then he says, but they probably deserved it, quite honestly. And so you think, okay, well, is he really being more sympathetic to Rosalie's situation? But then when he has a son, it's basically, you're gonna have to toughen up. Because wherever you live, you're gonna face all kinds of criticism and racism and everything else, and you're just gonna have to take that, so it's kind of like, well, okay. How sympathetic are you now? He's very proud of his son, there's no question about that, but it's the idea that. One case, he seems like, he can really understand, and he makes that comment, he said that, there's always another side of history, always another side, and then that's very true, certainly. I talk about history and historical events then too. With the uprising, remember that as things started to calm down, there were over 300 Dakota men and boys that were arrested in connection with the uprising itself. And out of those 300, President Lincoln commuted the sentences of all of them except for 38. Those 38 were hanged in Mankato. The largest public execution in American history was those 38 who suffered hangings. And then there are platters that you serve food on that have the depiction of the scaffolding where these 38 were hanged. That when you had that occurred December 26th, 1862. So the day after Christmas and everything. Then less than a week later, President Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation. Largest public hanging in American history, and the Emancipation Proclamation all within a week, So I think that's kind of interesting as well. But in the case of those individuals who suffered from the hanging then in Mankato, they were buried nearby, and within a week's period of time, most of those bodies had been exhumed and been dug up. And they went to a facility in Rochester, Minnesota. When you think of Rochester, you think of what? The Mayo Clinic. These were cadavers. They were going to use these bodies as cadavers at the Mayo Clinic.
Dr. Mayo has the skeleton of cut nose.
Cut nose, okay.
And he used it for himself and his two sons to learn the medical profession.
Because they were just bodies, and bodies of renegades, of hostiles, so there was that justification that they used. Little Crow, and that's another name for the Minnesota Uprising in 1862, the Little Crow's War. Little Crow was considered to be kind of the leader of the rebellion, so to speak. And the story is that the Indian agent, who was very ruthless, could not really care less about the Dakota people. The person who was given the responsibility of getting items from the federal government, food, clothing, shelter, whatever, and then making sure that the different tribal members actually received what they were promised by treaty, he made the comment, a man by the name of Andrew Myrick, and he made the comment that, and essentially this, if they're so hungry, let them eat grass, As the conflict came to an end, they found Andrew Myrick face down, and when they rolled him over, his mouth was full of grass. And somebody knew exactly who he was and what he said and everything else. But Little Crow, he was eventually shot. There was a huge bounty placed on his head, and his remains were taken to the Minnesota State Historical Society, where they remained until 1971, I believe it was. And then they were taken from the Historical Society, and his remains were actually interred at the cemetery at Flandreau, South Dakota. So you can go there today and you'll see, well, here's his gravesite and everything else. But the thing, from 1862 until the 1970s, his remains were actually with the Minnesota State Historical Society. It wasn't until the 1970s that they finally gave the man a proper burial. So there's so much history that she includes in this. I can see where 20 years of learning what to learn before you can actually write the book. Yes.
I didn't know about Lincoln's racism until a student told me, and I denied. Lincoln was not racist. And then I found the comments that he had written and just did not really view Native Americans as humans.
Right.
Which is, Lincoln's one of my heroes, but that's a sad reality. And that's the tremor of the time. And so when the dad is telling the boy to toughen up, a lot of that is just realistic. It's not necessarily cruel. It's just like, you're going to have a hard life.
This is the world in which you live.
And when you think that, our history is so violent.
Yes.
I'll defer to the historian on this, but I think I read somewhere that Lincoln originally had essentially only had about 2 of them that they were going to be hanged, but it was politically not.
There were actually over 300.
I know, but I mean, when it came down to Lincoln doing something,
Oh,
he initially only wanted to hang a couple. And then politically, it was not feasible for him. to do
It would have
that.
been a
There was
very
too much
unpopular-
outrage. And
Yeah.
so he relented and went to the
Yeah.
38.
38,
And
still lowering the number, but still a significant number to show that
Yeah.
he's even charged. So I've never heard that actually, but like it could very well be the case, but yeah, the bottom line, coming up with 38 that were gonna be executed, yeah. And they even to say they still have the memorial ride for the 38 that I think starts at Lower Brule maybe and goes over to Mankato. They do that on a year and in December of all times of the year. I don't know about you, but sometimes it gets kind of cold around here in December, so. So yes, far back.
For it smell like corn, sir. Who's in back of me?
Just a point of
Okay. Please,
1862, there's a civil war going on.
Yeah.
It's not going on good for Lincoln or the Union.
right,
And so politics
Yeah.
definitely were involved in lots of things.
yeah.
So
And then even his decision to finally have the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863. Well, that's because of the Civil War. And, you know, you look at what the Emancipation Proclamation was supposed to do and what it actually did, maybe 2 different things, but it was a political move. It was a military move, you know, to try to get slaves to side with the Union forces against the Confederacy, you know, so that was very much a big part of his decision. It was given the time, certainly. Now, if I may, we go from something that's been so heavy with boarding schools and the Dakota conflict and hangings and everything else. How about we talk about the first time?
I can't hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. The first time that she tried to plant a garden, you know, she accepts John's marriage proposal. So she's 18 years old. She's getting rid of that evil foster mother of hers. And she goes out to the farm. She's legally married to him, but she doesn't really want to be a wife, you know? And so her idea is that I'm just gonna sit here. I'm not gonna make him meals. I'm not gonna, you know, go out and do chores or like that. I'm just here. But what does John do? He wins her over with all of these kind acts. You know, his idea that he shows her where his family burials are located out in the tree grove. He talks about how significant the farm was and how it fell upon hard times. He watches her as she, well, in fact, he always makes her an egg sandwich, doesn't he? She's not gonna make meals, but you know what? She comes downstairs, there's an egg sandwich, there's a cup of coffee ready for her. He's winning her over through his kindness, you know. One day she's looking out the window as she normally did, you know, just because she's not doing anything else. And she decides on this snowy, wintry day that she's gonna walk towards the trees. Once she gets to the trees, you know, the kind of shelter and everything else. She starts walking and she realizes the snow is pretty deep. And in fact, she even loses her balance and she falls back. And you just kind of picture her out there in all that snow, just kind of looking up, and it's cool, it's crisp. She can see the clear sky, everything else, but then she starts getting cold. So she gets herself back up and she walks back into the farmhouse. And what does she see? John has some snowshoes and a walking stick ready for her and an egg sandwich. You know, and it's just those things where he just keeps doing these things and she's just kind of ignoring him for the most part, but he keeps doing these, you know. And then there's that one scene at the end of the chapter where she starts walking up to the bedroom. And of course, John, he'd sleep in the chair down there and have his few beers and everything. But as she's walking up the steps, she turns and she looks at him and she puts out her hand. And she said it was like she was drowning, saving a drowning man, because he took her hand. And that's when they consummated their marriage finally. You know, he won her over with the kindness. And then, of course, you have the son, Thomas, Wakpa being born. And that becomes a whole nother element of the story too. So, what about?
First night, when she indicates that she will have him come upstairs with her, he hadn't cracked open his beer yet.
Right.
And I think that was a big factor for her.
that she decided, well, maybe he can change.
Right.
Maybe he isn't a bee.
Very good point. Very good point.
I just thought that was real interesting. She points out these little tiny details for us and we have to pay
She really
attention.
does. She really does. And life for John becomes good. He doesn't drink every night. When he has his child, Thomas walk by, he takes him downtown to show him to the guys, and he's proud of his son, and he doesn't drink, but it's only when the farm situation starts getting bad again that all of a sudden you hear the beer being opened again at night, but yeah, things are going well for a while. Things are really going well. And so he's doing much better. He's not drinking excessively or anything like that. So, but in terms of planting that garden, let's go back to that. When she first found the seeds of John's mother's, Edna's seeds. And she finds Edna's seeds and Judith's seeds. Judith was the neighbor lady, and they had always gotten along well and planted gardens, but they did the same thing. They saved seeds. The whole idea of the story, the seed keeper, is that they saved these seeds and they would plant them. That would be the seeds for next year's garden. And so she sees these seeds and she doesn't know anything about gardening because she was used to the whole idea of nature is her grocery store. That's what her father had taught her. So what does she do? She takes these seeds and she pours them into a bowl, all kinds of different seeds. She goes out to the garden. And of course, she says, I'd like to have a garden. He goes, I'll get the rototiller out and I'll do that this afternoon. I mean, he's bending over backwards for it. So he tills the garden. She goes out there and she reaches into this bowl of all these different seed mixtures and she just starts throwing them, When she goes over to the neighbors and she meets Judith and Judith is working in her garden, she goes, oh, here's a row of corn, here's a row of beans, and here's a row of this and a row of that, And she goes, oh, I didn't quite do it that way, So they start developing a friendship and she learns more about gardening, certainly over a period of time. But there's also another thing I was going to point out about that, a couple more things, I suppose. One is that she goes to a washipi, a powwow in Mankato, and Gabby, her good friend, they always said that, or she said made the comment that Gabby was the mouth and Rosalie was the ears. Rosalie didn't talk too much, but she always listened. But Gabby, yeah, she was a person who was very much involved in environmental concerns, because they even used the term mini-wachoni, which from last year with Nick Estie's book, water is life. And here's Gabby, who becomes a lawyer and who becomes very much involved with conservation efforts, like not polluting the rivers and everything. But they go to this powwow. Gabby's there with her son Mato. Rosalie is there with her son Wakpa, and Gabby says something to the fact, well, how do you like farming? And Rosalie's response is, I don't farm like the big farms. I garden. Gardening is what you do to feed your family. She makes that distinction between farming and gardening. And I thought that was an important distinction, certainly. But then towards the very end, she comes into all these different frustrations with gardening and her attempts. She meets her great aunt, Darlene, whom she did not know even existed, and then right in that area, certainly, in all these years. But she sees that Darlene in her little apartment, she has corn growing, she has sunflowers growing, everything else. Talked about how Darlene would go out at night and go down to the city park and get up some pails of dirt and bring them back to the apartment so that she grow these things in her apartment. So she's learning all about this. Back when she was 14, when Marie was 14 during the Dakota War, and it's her and her little brother that's when you have the mother sowing the seeds into the hem of her dress, saying, you need these seeds. These are what we're going to feed our people with. And she talked about how I showed her even where there was a cache pit, where there was food from years gone by, or from last year's crop maybe, that had been put into this cache pit. And these cache pits were large. I mean, she said that when they opened it, and it's not just a hole in the ground, but when they opened it, that her mother slid down there and that you could just kind of see her mouth, so it was a situation of these are quite large, and they have beans, they have squash, they have the corn in there. And so she shows her all that, but she said, we don't know what's gonna happen, so you have to take these seeds. And so she sews them into the hem of her dress so that she can take them with her. Well, now she's learning the value of these seeds and the value of gardening and what her father had taught her and what her great grandmother had gone through as well. All these different things. And eventually they start planting these seeds, and there's this one fiasco after another. First one, those pesky squirrels, right? They came along, they ate everything, and so that ruined it. Then she tries again, and things are going so well. The corn is coming up nicely and everything else. And then just one night, the fear of every farmer is what happens weather-wise. Hail comes and just destroys everything. And she loses it. I mean, she's so frustrated. She's so mad. She can't do this. And that's when everybody starts coming together towards the end. You have Wilma, you have Carlos, you have her son, Thomas, who finally figured out where his mom has been for the last several months, up in this cabin. You have the neighbor lady who first found her when she went off on this little trip after John had passed away, Ida. You have all these people coming to help her, and they start to explain that, Carlos says, one, from now on, don't plant a garden, plant a couple different gardens, because if this garden gets hailed on, this one may not, so kind of spread it around a little bit. And then also the idea that when you plant your garden, the whole idea of the three sisters, the maize, the corn.
Seven little sisters.
Well, that was
Is
a
this
little bit,
different?
that was a
Okay.
reference to the Big Dipper, but the three sisters, which you'll find in the Hidatsa, the Arikara, the Mandan, and other cultures,
Oh, okay.
are corn, beans, and squash. And there's a certain way in which these gardens were planted. And that's the story behind Buffalo Bird Woman's garden, the Hidatsa woman, is that she goes through and she explains how the gardens were set up. I've told some groups when we discussed this book, I said, what I think would really be cool is if you had some kind of a 4-H group, or maybe some kind of a FFA group, or some other historical society, or whatever it might be, that would say, we're going to have a little community garden, and we're going to plant this community garden just like the Hidatsa and the Arikara and the Mandan did, and exactly what they were describing in the Seed Keeper, that you have the corn, and then you have the beans, and the beans will vine and they'll be supported, or they'll support the stalks of the corn. That you'll have the squash that will come out and they'll shade the ground. The beans will provide nutrients for the soil. There's a rhyme and reason for the whole idea of how these gardens were actually planted back then. And she's learning all this at the very end. So that's one of the
Also, probably shade and keep the weeds out.
oh, yeah, it definitely keeps it's like putting mulch down when you have all these different plants that are supposed to be there and they're keeping the weeds out. Absolutely. Yes.
My son-in-law's from Connecticut, and he and my daughter live in Lincoln. So he did this garden thing, because he read it, and he is
Very
just
good.
so impressed with the Midwest, he loves the Midwest. His corn didn't grow, his beans didn't get very high, and he says, I don't know what happened to the squash. And we were just laughing because I told him, I haven't read all the book yet, that he had to read this book, and he goes, our tribe died. It didn't work for him, so he's gonna try it again next
Yeah.
year.
So, yes.
Didn't the immigrants coming over from the Scandinavian countries, they brought their seeds too, sewed in dresses?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Really?
And even other, wheat was not found in the Americas until Europeans arrived. So, and there certainly were a lot of crops that ended up going back to Europe too, like potatoes, for example, tomatoes and others. Corn, corn was found in the Americas. So it's a very good point as well. Yeah, so you get into this whole idea that she's finally getting this whole idea of saving the seeds and gardening and being able to save them for years to come. But then I think the two biggest twists for me, and I always love a story with a good twist. But one of the twists is that when everybody's coming to support her and everything else, who pulls up in the car but Gabby? And Gabby is Wilma's niece, I believe, Well, she's known Gabby for a long time. She just has met Wilma, and then also find out, you guys are related, So there's that connection, which I thought was pretty cool. But there's also the idea of Ida's dog. Ida, again, the lady who lived next door who found Rosalie when she first moved out there and cold and starving and everything. She'd bring food over. She was the one who kept care of of her father's cabin. Even the star quilt that her mother had made when Rosalie was very, very young. Rosalie was 4 years old when her mother committed suicide. And so it's a situation where the star quilt was there, very well kept. It wasn't one of these abandoned places where somebody has come along and broken the windows, or if they did, they were replaced. Ida did that. Ida did all that, took care of the place. And Ida has a dog named Digger. And I one of the biggest twists, I think, early in the book, going back to Marie Blackbird and the 1860s, that her mother, before she leaves them, she says, okay, you're gonna have these seeds, take care of them, shows her the cache pit, and it's marked with a flat stone. You have a buffalo scapula that's there as well, and this is 1862, right? And in the midst of all this, at the very end, here comes Digger the dog, and he has a buffalo scapula. And it's kind of like, well, of course, she doesn't make the connection. I mean, she doesn't know about her great grandmother telling her great grandmother what had happened or anything about this cache pit. But this is her land. This is her tribal land. And so they go out and they look and they realize, look, here's a huge cache pit. No connection that they can make in terms of the family. But if you've read the book, that's the cache pit that Marie was talking about clear back in 1862. And here it is in 2002 and finding that, so it's like, that's a cool twist. So to think about 10 years of writing a book like this, writing a novel, and to think about, and I asked her, I said, well, at what point in those 10 years did you say, this is the twist I'm going to have at the end? And she said, well, I've always been kind of thinking about that. But she said, it's the whole story that you tell in between that you have to work on to make sure it all comes together. So with 4 different narrators, a host of different historical references, it is, I think, a very interesting read. So I know we're about out of time, but any closing comments? Anything that doesn't have to be anything that I've brought up or anything else, but any closing thoughts? Yes.
I really liked on page 11, the statement about our land, how important it is to all of us. Maybe we all carry an instinct to return home to the horizon line that formed us, to the place where we knew the world.
Yeah.
I think we can all relate to that. We live on farms that maybe are second and third generations.
Yeah. And to think of the changing in agriculture over all the decades, and not just in equipment, but genetically modified, that talk about, well, how did John die? Was it because of the spraying that was being done, and that's what made him ill? I mean, because the name of the company, the seed company that she brings up, is modified from Monsanto, but Monsanto really did work with Agent Orange that was used during Vietnam, and we know what happened to a lot of Vietnam veterans who were exposed to that, certainly.
And I like the running theme throughout the book about when you really trust what the government says.
Even now.
Yeah, even now? What?
I like page 335. The seeds Darlene had given me were saved by generations of women who believed their work was essential to their family's survival, not just as food, but as an expression of who they were.
Right.
That's kind of good to me.
Yeah, the title of seed keeper is very pertinent. No question about
And
it.
I can see her planting seeds on John's farm
Yes.
and on her.
Yeah.
Well, and John saying, well, if the government says it's okay, just be good.
Exactly. Well, I'll just close with this if I may, but in the very northern reaches of Norway, there's an island, and they have what is called the Doomsday Vault. Are you familiar with that? Yeah. Deep in the bowels of an icy mountain on an island above the Arctic Circle between Norway and the North Pole lies a resource of vital importance for the future of humankind. It's not coal, oil, or precious minerals. It's seeds. Millions of these tiny brown specks from more than 930,000 varieties of food crops are stored in what is called the Global Seed Vault in Norway. It's essentially a huge safety deposit box holding some of the world's largest collection of agricultural biodiversity. Inside this building is 13,000 years of agricultural history. And I thought, talk about your seed keepers, so and this is a real place, and let's face it, there's a lot of animals that are becoming extinct and that have become extinct over the years, as is part of the changing world in which we live. But that's also true of plant life. There's a lot of plants that are also disappearing. And to think that somebody started this project where they're gonna keep this doomsday vault and keep seeds of all these different plants that many of them may no longer actually thrive in the natural world. I thought that was interesting too. So I thought I'd share that with just as kind of a conclusion. So I'll stick around for a few more minutes, but.
Yeah, on
Oh,
Zoom,
yes.
Carol says that at the USD, John Day Gallery, their current exhibit in the College of Fine Arts is the Oscar Howe Legacy Across 4 Generations.
Yes.
It says the 4 Generations exhibition at USD seeks to explore the impact and influence of Howe's work by showcasing the work of 16 different artists from various decades succeeding Howe's. These artists will display personal responses and recreation of Howe's works, which will be displayed alongside the original works.
And Carol, I think that's only open for a couple more weeks, is it not?
Well, and
The Oscar Howe.
the Brookings one,
Yeah,
the Brookings one closes September 17th.
that's what I was thinking of.
That one, Oscar House that have been in private homes and haven't been on an exhibition. I wish I could get up there to see it.
I went to see it. It was wonderful. You better take off sometime.
Okay.
We will have a week to
It was
go.
really good.
Yep, this one I think is in response, I think this is in kind of competition with. Brookings.
Oh, okay.
We can show you how he's influenced John.
And then we have an Oscar Howe exhibit at the library, the government library at Dakota too.
And then one of the best ones is at the chapel at the St. Joseph's in England. That's one of the best Oscar House.
She said the one here at USD is open in
USD.
October.
Okay, thank you. So that is the USD.
Brookings is September 17th.
Okay, so, well, folks, I want to go ahead, one more.
I was just gonna say, if you've never seen a cash pit in
Mm.
the state park at Sioux Falls, the Gooder State
Oh,
Park
yes, yes.
has an excellent depiction of what on
Where's
the
the
inside
park?
of it.
Southeast of Sioux Falls.
Yeah, just a bit
Good,
south.
good earth or.
South Dakota's newest state park.
Right, right.
Better.
Folks,
They have there, what did you say they have there?
A cash pit.
the display of a cash.
A display of a cash.
Yeah, how it actually arranged, you have the ears of corn, you have the loose grain, you have squash, just again, how it was arranged. It was done with a lot of thought, certainly. And then they were quite large. These were the cupboards, if you will, of a lot of these early cultures. And so, but thank you so much, and I'll stick around, but thank you for having me. Thank you for all your time. There is the evaluation forms. Those are anonymous. One of the sad things I